Okay.
Okay? Okay. Thank you for coming today. We're glad that you all could make it. Good to see some new people. Good to see some people, who've been with us for a while. And I want to introduce my former teacher, Reuben Jackson. Reuben Jackson is an archivist with the University of the District of Columbia's Felix E. Grant Jazz Archives. From 2013 until 2018, he was host of Friday Night Jazz on Vermont Public Radio. His poems have been published in over 40 anthologies and in a volume entitled Fingering the Keys, which will be reissued with new poems in October by Allen Squire Press. The volume is called Scattered Clouds. His music reviews have appeared in the Washington Post, Jazz Times, Downbeat, Jazz's, the Jazz Journalists Association website, and on National Public Radio's All Things Considered. He taught poetry for 11 years at the Writers Center in Bethesda, Maryland, and taught high school for 2 years in Burlington, Vermont. He was an archivist and creator with the Smithsonian Institution's Duke Ellington collection from 1989 until 2009. Okay.
I'm old. All right. Well, thank you. Thanks for coming out today. Beautiful day. What I'm going to do is read some pieces. We have like 30 minutes, so I was hoping, if you have questions or anything in between stuff, I'm hoping that you're not bashful. I mean, how many writers here? You can tell me, like, it's like Vegas. What happens in Rockville stays in Rockville. So, I'm sorry, hands again? Okay, okay. People who love writing but don't write? You can be both if you want to. Okay, all right. So, I do have a new book coming out. My first book, Fingering the Keys, came out in 1991, which seems like about 200 years ago. In fact, I was telling a student, I live in Hyattsville, and I tutor this young man twice a week, and he was asking me questions about, what was it like when your first book came out? Because for him, 1991 is like 1891. He's 10th grader. And I said, well, he said, what did you do about going to readings and doing stuff like that? And I said, I went to, you know what Conestoga wagons were? You know, when the settlers sort of gentrified the West, they rode in these wagons. I said, well, we go from town to town, Conestoga wagons. They had like 2 horses. You go do a reading. When the reading was over, you go to like a campground, spend the night, get up the next morning. He kind of thought I was serious for him. This is what people think, man, he's old. But anyway, I had just got the galleys for this book, Scattered Clouds, which comes out October 1st, which will be my 64th birthday. And what I'll do in the short time we have is read from some of the sections. I grew up in D.C. And any D.C. natives here? They're hard to come by. All right. It's like tofu. Yeah, that'll work. D.C. natives like tofu in a steakhouse. They're hard to find. But so I grew up in D.C. Went to D.C. public schools. High school. Went to college in Vermont. Little school called Goddard College. But a lot of the poems in Fingering the Keys and the newer things have to do with growing up in D.C. and changes which were taking place, mid to late 1950s. And it's interesting to see, like, I have a lot of friends here who still live in the same neighborhood. Like, people think of D.C. as many things, but, like the government town image that people have, and they say, well, it's constantly changing. Well, it is, but a lot of my friends still live in the same houses I knew from growing up. Like, the parents retired or died and my friends took over. So we've seen white flight and now gentrification. So some of the newer things look at those changes, but I want to start with some things from my childhood. And like I said, if you have any questions or you can't hear me, please, feel free to jump in. Okay. In fact, I'm gonna start with this. This is, hi, how are you?
Good.
Oh, come on in, have a seat. think when I died, like when the, the pharaohs in Egypt would have stuff in the burial chambers to take with them to the next life, I'm putting Coca-Cola in my burial chamber, you know. So I grew up in Northwest DC, and you know, you're growing up, you're a kid, and suddenly you see the neighborhood in which I grew up was predominantly white, Jewish, and then white flight started to happen. So white people leaving on, you know, every weekend. We call it like the weekend of moving vans. My friends and I, we thought, and it's when you start to realize something was going on in the world, which you couldn't help but take it personally, even as a kid. But I think one of the things I try to look at is the complexities of being both just a young person watching TV and having daydreams, and back then comic books and all that stuff. And then you see this other thing which is happening. And I saw my parents trying to explain this stuff that we'd see on TV, like the civil rights demonstrations and all. So this piece is called White Flight, Washington, D.C., 1958. Excuse me. No more densely freckled girls looking dreamily at the leaves passing by the window. No more playmates staring quizzically at the colored people on my father's album covers. Sarah Goldfarb reminded me of a girl I saw in an old MGM movie, even though her father said that, like, my crush on her was impossible. Rocco Quinzani was a dead ringer for Ricky Nelson. Who and where was I? You need a tardy slip, young lady. Tardy slip, let's go. Here's a former student of mine, but I guess you don't get tardy slips in creative writing classes. You have to do 2 poems for an assignment, not instead of 1 for the next week. Another thing I try to have in the book are portraits of people I grew up with. And, you know, maybe this has happened to you, or people, and it's okay, but they see you in one light. Like, people will say to me, oh, you know, you didn't experience these things because you worked at the Smithsonian for 20 years. You were a curator and all that. But I saw a lot of mayhem and really, I'd say, depression around my peers and with my peers. And part of what I try to do, I guess, in a way is, you know, you go down on the mall and you see monuments to this war, and that's fine, but a lot of my friends I think about constantly, you know, they've maybe been forgotten in a way, but just to, and maybe this is something you do as writers, to capture people who had an impact on you, you know, whether it's through something they said, how they helped you, or even, in this case, this is like the first, there were 1, 2, 3, there were 4 kids in my neighborhood who committed suicide before I was 10. And you think people don't talk about it now, but back then, there was nothing. So this kid, Teddy, who we played ball in the alleys behind my parents' house, and he was, well, you'll hear about him. He was kind of awkward and shy, and then blah, blah, blah. So this is for Teddy. Big ears, sad clown face played left flanker. That section of playground where cobwebs grew and yard markers ceased. This did not stop him from awkward stabs at perfection. Size 13 kids jostling one another, turning post patterns into 15-yard tragedies starring himself. It was a conspiracy, he shouted, and he was right. Offense and defense laughed so loud, we did not hear the pistol. Rumor was that it pierced his left temple. Death by loneliness, we wondered, the mortician smoothed all clues away. I'm not gonna dwell just on these elegies, but I do, the older I get, the more I think about, you think about your path in life and the stuff you saw, good and bad. And I would say writing and music probably saved me. I mean, my parents would also kick my butt if I did stupid things, but you see stuff happening around you, and again, you know, you probably experienced this to some degree or another, like you're trying to fit in, this stuff that you love is like tapping you on the shoulder saying, you should learn more about me, and then you're also dealing with, like, your friends disappear, and you wonder what happened, and sometimes I'd ask adults, even my parents, like, what happened to Teddy? And they would change the subject and say, oh, I think, well, it wasn't the Nationals, like the Senators or baseball team. The Senators are on TV at 2 o'clock. So, you know, part of what we do as humans and as writers is kind of wonder about things. Like Langston Hughes, part of his autobiography was in 2 volumes. One was The Big C, but the other one was I Wonder as I Wander. So, you know, we kind of wonder as we kind of bouncing through life. So this is one more. This is Little Man, September '63. Now, I don't know if people still use nicknames now. I assume the world seems to change so much now, but see, there was like Big Man in our neighborhood who was like 6'4", and then Little Man was 5'5", you know, and he would sit on the porch, and we just want, you know, he'd come out and hang out sometimes, but he just always sat, and he was always kind of staring off into space. And I mean, he's another one of, you know, our peers who just didn't make it. So I'll just do that again. I'm trying to give you a sense. It's not the only thing that happened in my youth or in my neighborhood, but I think it's important that people know where you're coming from, and I think as writers trying to pay, like, you know, homage to your path, right? So this is Little Man, September 1963. There's a cloud in your head you try and conceal. A cloud just like the kid up the street who lives on the porch and broods like a 7-year-old Jeremiah. The occasional domestic fistfight punctuates the weighty sentence he has become. One day he calls you over and asks about the books you always carry. He wants to know if you know what people are whispering. Are you lonely, he asks, as if he didn't know the answer. He knows you know the lyrics to his song. Any, you know, I know some of you are going to leave after the reading, but any questions or anything you want to ask them? Such shy individuals. Okay, I'll just, you know, it's, you good then?
We could like do a Q&A afterward, maybe?
Okay, I just didn't know, I know Marianne said some people were leaving, and I thought if anybody would. Okay, I can read less and you can ask questions more. How about that? I can drink Coke, a cola in between. Okay. Yesterday would have been my mother's 95th birthday. And, you know, talking about like your life path and similarities, the older I become, the more I realize I'm like my mom. And, you know, you're growing up with like your family, you're trying to be yourself. And I remember saying to my brother, who was 8 years older, I'll never, like, I love my mother, but I thought my life is going to be real different. It's not going to be like that. You know, you go through a phase where maybe you're rebelling and that sort of thing. Well, okay, my mom taught DC public schools for many years. Her specialty was language arts, so writing, that kind of thing. I, you know, worked with music collections at the Smithsonian. My mother played classical piano, and, you know, I did these music reviews. She wanted to be a journalist, a print journalist, like newspapers, and write about music. At the time, you know, it was virtually impossible for African Americans to get those jobs. And so my mom died 2006, November 2006. We're at the funeral, my brother's sitting next to me, and the church clerk is talking about, you know, the work my mother did with the poetry club. She did workshops in the school, in the church, in the community. And my brother's kicking me going, uh-huh. And his point was like, you thought you were different, but you're not. I mean, I think to use a musical term, we're kind of like variations on a theme, you know? You're like, maybe you think you're this far in terms of difference when you might just be like this. So this is my mother in the afterlife, you know, and one thing about her though, she was, like, she didn't like blue jeans and stuff, so I'm wearing these jeans, she would not be thrilled. And so it's kind of like poking fun of her, but remembering people's characteristics, what makes us who we are as individuals. My mother in the afterlife. It's 1970 again. My mother is shaking her head at the sight of my clothing. She never abandoned her dream of a world without denim. Now there's no escaping her critique. You can't have coffee with God looking like that. She rolls her eyes at Abby Hoffman and at Bill, who owned the head shop near her house. Death has restored her mind. Now she's talking curfew. My brother laughs behind a cloud. Now let me just say a couple things about this piece. So it's 1970. This is still, it's not the 1960s in terms of strict chronology, but there's still a lot of tumult in the country that kind of, see, for me, what people call dissent now and resistance is like cutting steak with plastic knives. It's nothing. Just like 2 years after Martin Luther King was assassinated, and stuff was going on, you know. So Abby Hoffman was a political activist. I just wanted to mention that because I used his name. Head shops were places where you could buy like black light posters, rolling papers for pot, stuff like that, you know, underground comic books. So it's that time, but even past that time, my mother would be like, you know, if you came over to the house for dinner and your khakis were wrinkled, she'd say, "Did your iron break? Is there something wrong with the iron in your house?" So, but I think of her, again, because we're so much alike, and I miss, you become, can I use minor profanity?
Yeah, please.
Okay, well, like you become a grown-ass man, but you still, I was the baby of the family, and my mom and I were friends for the most part, and I miss just talking to her about like sports. You know, if there's like a bad call of football game, the phone would ring. I knew who it was. He said, that damn referee is like, you know, these new glasses or something. So people who didn't make it, your parents, I mean, these are, like I said, pieces of my upbringing. Let's see. So I went to college in Vermont. I worked for Smithsonian for 20 years, and then I took early retirement, and this is the other time I became I was a high school teacher for 2 years. Another, you know, similarity with my mom working in public schools. I came back home last February. I had the interview for this job at UDC, and they called me 2 days later, and I thought, I had this radio show job, but it was pre-recorded, and I thought, am I really gonna stay here till May? It's like winter in Vermont, I mean, hardcore. You know how we freak out, we get like 4 inches of snow, and you listen to and I'm not giving them a hard time, but you watch the TV news, and it's like, the voice is real shrill. So we're gonna get 4 inches tomorrow, up to 4 inches. And in Vermont, they say, they can tell you like you're getting a foot, but they say it like if I said, you know, I really like your t-shirt. It's that tone of voice, and you think, damn. So I can't, anyway, but you know, it was a rough winter. I came home, I found a place to live, blah, blah, blah. But, you know, it's like you're readjusting. I've lived in a rural environment for 7 years, and it's still my home. But you have to adjust. And one of the things I wanted to return to and still had to deal with was not being stared at all the time. Like Vermont is the second whitest state in the country. Mm-hmm. And even if people have not so nice thoughts, you just walk around the street, people just look at you. So these pieces address coming back here, and you know, I'd be kind of silly sometimes, just like tell people you go to a restaurant and say, damn, nobody stared at me. And they're like, you know, you gonna eat the hummus or what? You know. So these are, this is in like 4 sections. It's called This African American Life. And it's a takeoff on, there's a show on National Public Radio called This American Life. So this is one. I hope I live as long as the nails of the sister sitting beside me on this crowded subway. 2. Oh, my feelings are so hurt. No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'll start again. Hi, you a tardy slip?